All right, thank you all for joining us for the Gaining Confidence as a Graduate Student, Researcher, and/or Professional workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Amanda Hoffman, Visiting Assistant Professor, Educational Psychology, Leadership, and Higher Education. They will be introducing us to self-efficacy theory and ways to build our own efficacy through various sources. And without further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Hoffman to get us started.
Okay, like Josh said, we are going to talk about developing confidence as a graduate student, as a researcher, or a professional. This kind of is kind of broadly applicable to any of those three roles that you hold at any given time. And so just an agenda. I'm going to go through like a quick introduction of myself. Then we're going to talk about some ways that graduate students struggle with confidence and in terms of imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. Then we're going to go through self-efficacy theory and finish with some examples of ways that you can build your confidence and build that efficacy throughout your time here at UNLV. And then I'll take any questions that you might have at the end. So just some background on me. My name is Amanda Hoffman. I am a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology, Leadership, and Higher Education in the College of Education. I graduated from Mizzou with my PhD just last year in 2022. And so I am recently where you all were sitting as graduate students. And so my research is kind of focused on two paths. I do a lot of motivation research in terms of academic success and motivation for college athletes. But then methodologically, I look at psychometrics and scale development for psychological scales. And so my motivation piece is we're really going to focus on today, and I'm actually teaching this self-efficacy lecture next week in my motivation class. And so this is going to be good practice for me to teach that lecture. So graduate students can sometimes suffer from low confidence in their abilities. I think the two major ways that that presents itself is through imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. And so I know myself when I was going through my graduate school process, but also even now as a faculty member, I still experience these things. And so the first one being imposter syndrome. And so this is when high achieving students or high achieving individuals kind of doubt their skills, their abilities, their successes, their reasons for kind of being where they are. So for graduate students, that can kind of appear as you constantly being worried that somebody's going to figure out that you don't really know what you're talking about, that you like kind of tricked the system into letting you into your graduate program, and everyone's going to eventually expose you for the fraud that you are, and that you're not really that smart. And so this is something that happens for a lot of graduate students. They have this kind of constant anxiety that they're not necessarily good enough to be in their program. And so there's kind of differences, different interpretations of this for different genders. So this Bravada piece from 2019 was a meta-analysis or a kind of literature review of imposter syndrome, and they found that 16 studies found that there were gender differences in imposter syndrome, where female students and female identifying students had higher levels of that imposter syndrome than male identifying students. But they also found 17 articles that found no statistical significant difference. And so it really just, I think, depends on the context, and I'm sure a lot of that had to do with sample sizes, things like that. It's not a hard and fast rule that female identifying students will definitely have more imposter syndrome or see higher levels of imposter syndrome, but there is some evidence that shows that that is true. But the biggest thing in understanding imposter syndrome is understanding its impacts. And so imposter syndrome can have pretty big influences on one's mental health. And so you're already stressed in graduate school, right? You're dealing maybe with balancing work, balancing your home life, and balancing school. And so adding on this kind of consistent anxiety about your skills and your worthiness in your program is just kind of compounding that stress that you're already experiencing from the general experience of being in graduate school. And so there's some comorbidity in terms of imposter syndrome and anxiety, with depression, kind of like low self-esteem, things like that are kind of mental health impacts that come from higher levels of imposter syndrome. And then imposter syndrome also has effects on your behavior and performance within graduate school. So I know that I personally, when I felt the highest levels of imposter syndrome, that's where I found myself procrastinating the most, right? If you don't feel like you belong or you don't feel like you're going to do well enough on this assignment, then you are more likely to procrastinate on those assignments. If you feel like you don't belong, you are more likely to drop out of your program of study rather than persist through maybe setbacks that you have, and kind of give up on that goal of achieving your either master's degree or PhD. And it can have negative impacts on your academic performance as well. And so, like I said before, if you're procrastinating, you're not going to put out your best work. And so you want to make sure that you are kind of not having these constant state of anxiety so you can do better on in the academic realm. And so another way that I think kind of goes along with imposter syndrome is this idea of stereotype threat. And so stereotype threat was coined in 95 by Steele and Aronson, and this is a pretty layman's interpretation of it, of that it's stereotype threat happens when your personal identities influence the way you understand and reflect on the situation. And so individuals don't want to perpetuate maybe negative stereotypes about their identities. And so I think a lot of the seminal research in this area really took place in the 90s with women in like STEM fields. But it also applies to race and ethnicity. It applies to sexual orientation. It just really depends on the context. Whatever stereotype is prevalent about your identity in any given situation, it will vary based on the situation that you're in. And so because individuals don't want to perpetuate those negative stereotypes, they sometimes seek to overperform, and sometimes that can backfire, right? It can, again, create those higher levels of anxiety and depression because you are constantly trying to prove that you are different than the stereotype. Additionally, it impacts your behavior and performance in that it again predicts dropping out if you do happen to fail on an assignment that might perpetuate that stereotype that fits your identity. You're not as likely to persist through difficult times if you have higher levels of this stereotype threat. So I'm going to I want to see if I can do this, a quick poll of, oh, it's not working. Okay. But if you have experienced this, just know that it is normal. Like, you are not alone in your experiences of these thoughts and feelings because it happens to many graduate students. And like I said, I am a relatively new professional. I became a professor in August of last year, and I still have these ideas of imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. And so one way to combat these feelings of low confidence is using self-efficacy. And so self-efficacy is kind of where my theoretical background lies. This is the major theory that I use to write my dissertation and how I kind of frame a lot of the work that I do in my research. And so, in the most simple terms, self-efficacy is your confidence in your ability to complete a task. And so, the unique thing about self-efficacy that's different than like self-esteem or self-concept is that self-efficacy is very task specific. And so it's not just saying like, oh, I'm good at math. This is saying like I can write a journal article or I can complete a structural equation modeling analysis, things like that. So it's very task driven. And this was conceptualized by Albert Bandura in the 70s. An important thing to note here is that self-efficacy is your own perceptions of your ability. It has really, I mean, it is connected to your actual ability, but it does not necessarily present a realistic evaluation of your actual ability. It's just how you are perceiving your abilities. And so there's four major sources: master experience, vicarious experience, verbal persuasion, and physiological responses. And we'll get into that a little bit. We're going to go deeper into those. But again, these just like stereotype threat and imposter syndrome, these can have impacts on your behavior and academic performance. So those with low self-efficacy are, again, those people that are likely to drop out of their program if they experience a difficult situation. They're more likely to have people with low self-efficacy have higher levels of anxiety, whether that be general anxiety or test anxiety, things like that. They're more likely to have those self-sabotaging behaviors. So things like procrastination and kind of not studying for any tests that you're taking, kind of finding ways to kind of excuse if you do have a bad performance that you've self-sabotaged, and so you have an excuse that it's not just your ability. So you're kind of protecting that your confidence by self-sabotaging. And then this idea of learned helplessness is kind of the opposite of self-efficacy, the opposite of your confidence. And so learned helplessness is this idea that if you believe you have no control over the situation and you have repeated failures, then you're just going to give up. And so I think the early research on this was done with rats where they shocked their tails. And then if they found out that they were going to shock their tails and not get any reward for it, then they eventually just didn't even try to avoid the shock. They just kind of let it happen. And so it's the same it can be the same in any kind of psychological situation too, in that if you get repeated failures, maybe on tests or papers, but you see no kind of way out to build that confidence, then you're going to kind of give up. And that's where a lot of students, I think, kind of drop out of their programs and kind of abandon their goals of completing a graduate degree. Okay, so I'm going to go through the sources of self-efficacy, kind of from the most influential to the least influential. And so the best way to influence your self-efficacy is through mastery experiences. And so this is when you experience personal success on the task or the task that you're interested in. And so does anyone have any examples of the first time that they experienced kind of their own personal success on something and that made them more confident to do it in the future? Go ahead, Joy.
No, I think it was when I wrote my statement of intent of purpose, getting into college. It was a great reflection of everything that I've done and the work that I did. I think that is when I realized that I could do it. Not that imposter syndrome didn't still come after getting into the master's program, but that was my first real um, feeling of success, I guess, even though I realized I didn't realize or how much work I had put in before, but getting my third degree in undergrad, that was the point. It's
Yeah.
by the third.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. So you kind of, we'll talk about a little bit about self-reflection later when we talk about like ways to increase your self-efficacy, because you need to be able to see your own successes to know that they happened almost. Okay, and so the next one is vicarious experience. And so vicarious experience is experiencing others' success on the task that you're interested in. And so an important caveat to this is that the others that you're observing need to be similarly situated to yourself. And so it doesn't help me think that I can hit a home run if I watch Aaron Judge hit a home run. I'm a sports person and a New York sports person. So it doesn't help me to, right? Because he's what, 6'8", 270 pounds. Like he's nowhere, we're physically very different. We have very different experiences. But if I go to AERA and I see my colleague, my grad school colleague, present their poster there and be successful, I would feel much more confident in my abilities to then go to AERA and present my poster, because we're in a pretty similarly situated world, right? There, we are at the same institution. We have pretty similar experiences with our faculty and our support there. And so that importance of similarity is really important when it comes to vicarious experiences. So does anyone have an example of when they watched or saw somebody else or watched a video of somebody else be successful at something and it helped to improve their own confidence? Go ahead.
So I was going to give a presentation at a conference, and my lab mate was also going to give a presentation as well. And so it was like both of us were kind of stressed about it, but it was cool to see her kind of rise up to the bar when she gave her presentation. Like she did really well. So I was like, oh, if she can do it, I can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It's that, and it helped that you were from the same lab, right? You had similar experiences here at UNLV or wherever you might have been if you were, it was before here. And so you kind of knew that you had similar training and you, that if they could do it, you could also do it. Awesome. Thank you. So the next one is verbal persuasion. And so this is it's kind of getting this external piece again, but here, instead of seeing somebody be successful, this is somebody telling you you're successful. And so this is, that you can be successful. And so this is where the importance of kind of teachers, coaches, if it's an athletic area, and other mentors is really important. And so this is somebody telling you, like your advisor or peers telling you like, hey, you can actually do what you are seeking out to do. So does anyone have an example of that when they were influenced by other people? I can go ahead and give this one. When I went to go do my dissertation proposal, or not my dissertation proposal, but the actual dissertation defense, I was super scared, right? Like everybody is super scared when they present any part of like their thesis or dissertation, any kind of those like major hurdles that you kind of have to get over. And so a colleague of mine and a friend of mine had defended her dissertation the year before. And so we set aside like a half an hour the day of my dissertation defense to kind of just like have a like talk where she kind of just like hyped me up. And so you can do this to yourself too. And so what I did, actually, which was really helpful, I put little sticky notes on the wall behind my computer that said like, you can do it. You're the expert. Like you did this, you know what I mean? Like kind of doing your own personal affirmations. Doesn't necessarily have to be from somebody else, but just your self-evaluation of your ability. really helped in terms of building my confidence in that presentation. And then the last one is physiological reactions. And this is kind of the weakest influence on confidence, but it still has some influence on your efficacy. And so this is kind of your emotional and physical reactions, like unconscious reactions to the task. And so kind of the examples that I always give to my students when I'm explaining this is if you are sitting at a desk for one of your classes and your teacher says, put everything away except for a pen and a piece of paper, right? That immediately thinks you're going to take a pop quiz. And if you have test anxiety, right, you're going to start sweating or your heart is going to start racing. If you're giving a presentation and you're not super comfortable with it, you might get those kind of shaky knees and kind of sweaty palms. And so does anyone have an example of when that happened to them, that they had these kind of distinct emotional reactions? Go ahead.
Specifically, I guess, heart racing. That I have a stage fright thing. And I know you're supposed to kind of like embrace that because it does mean that you care and you want to be there, but you don't want to forget everything that you're supposed to say at the same time. So I'm just working on that, but just doing speeches here and there, but it's coming along.
Yeah, but it definitely affects, you can be super confident in the content, you can be super confident in like what you've written and how you're going to say it. But as soon as you get up there and your like hands start shaking or your heart starts racing, and then your mind starts racing and you kind of lose the confidence that you've built throughout the like preparation for that presentation or speech or whatever the activity was. And so while it doesn't, I don't know that emotional responses and these physiological responses have like sustained long-term effects on your confidence. It does definitely have effects on your confidence. And so Yasmin said in the chat that during comps, that they felt ill and very stiff and telling themselves to breathe. And so that's what we're going to talk on the next slide about, kind of ways that we can build our self-efficacy to kind of make sure that we're more confident in our abilities and we're not falling victim to either that imposter syndrome or stereotype threat. And so building efficacy as a graduate student, what can we do? First, I want to go through mastery experiences. And so one thing that helps to build your experience, and especially with mastery experience, is kind of scaffolding your success. So I would say that almost no one gets their first grant funded, right? It's difficult to get money, right? It's especially like, let's say you want to get an NIH grant or a NSF grant, things like that, right? The first time you write an NIH grant or an NSF grant, the likelihood that you get funded is pretty low. And if you shoot for the moon right away, it might crush your confidence. And so maybe instead of going straight for NSF or NIH, that you write a grant that's at the university level or your professional organization level, your department level, things like that, that you can kind of scaffold those goals to eventually say, oh, I got this departmental goal, then I got this institutional goal, then I got the goal, then I got this grant from my AER SIG or division, and then I use AER because I'm the College of Ed, but any professional organization. And then you set yourself up and you say, oh, I've succeeded in all these kind of smaller steps leading up to this big goal. And so now I feel confident in my ability to write that and get funded for a grant. And it's the same thing when you're thinking about publishing articles, right? Maybe, so I know that in educational psychology, the Journal of Educational Psychology and Contemporary Educational Psychology are two of our like pretty well-renowned journals, right? And so maybe when I'm submitting articles, I don't submit my first article to JEP, but instead I submit it to a more a smaller job that has maybe a higher submission or a higher selection rate, things like that, where you're kind of setting yourself up for success rather than, I'm not saying don't shoot high, but also recognize that there are like, it doesn't say anything about your ability when you shoot for like super high grants or super renowned publications and then don't get accepted. It doesn't say anything about your ability, but it could hurt that perceived ability. And then this self-reflection piece that Joy talked about earlier is really important because you all have been very successful to make it to this point in your career, right? But still that imposter syndrome will come in and say like, oh, I was just doing this. Like anytime somebody tells me that I must be smart because I have a PhD, I immediately tell them I just took a lot of naps because I'm like pushing away that kind of like success, right? But when you reflect and you say, hey, I actually wrote a 120-page dissertation and I did all this statistical analysis and I've published you know what I mean? When you self-reflect and kind of look back on your previous achievements, you can show yourself that you actually have the capabilities and the skills needed to be here and that you deserve to be in your program and you deserve to get your degree. And then the last part I think about mastery experiences that I excluded here is this idea of training. So a lot of times when you are doing, maybe I thought about this mostly in terms of like statistical analyses. I don't know how many of you are quantitative people. But I teach statistics within the College of Education, and most of my students come in and they say, I am not a math person, right? I'm bad at math. I won't be able, I don't want to, I'm here, in the words of Marshawn Lynch, I'm just here so I don't get fined, right? They're just taking statistics because they need it as a requirement for their program. And so building up your training in anything that you're kind of less confident in will really help you to build that confidence, right? So there's tons of ways that you can do training in any kind of thing that there's statistical trainings, there's public speaking trainings, right? There's all these different things that you can go to, classes that you will get some personal experience in that area that will help you to build the confidence that you need. So vicarious experiences, the biggest one is just actually going and observing others. So whether that be if you're going to a conference, going to the graduate student poster session, even if you're not presenting, so that you can see people not only from your department or your lab, but also graduate students from other institutions. And it kind of gives you tips and tricks that you can use when you are doing your own presentations or building your own publications that you can take from and see that others did this and they were successful, so maybe I can do it as well. And with vicarious experiences, also, I think developing this kind of combines with verbal persuasion, but developing this community of learning. And so making sure that you are learning from each other, whether that be peers, faculty members, but kind of not comparing yourself to other people, but using other people as a means for growing your own knowledge. And so I think I am not a person that's motivated by competition at all, but academia is kind of set up that way, right? Like it's who's going to get the one job in that field, right? And so we want to make sure that instead of like building these competitive relationships, that we're instead kind of building these communities of learning from one another and taking experiences and watching other people to build your own confidence. Next is verbal persuasion. And so the first, and I think most important part here is finding good mentors. And so mentors do not necessarily have to be your advisor, right? So your campus advisor can be a great mentor. But it also, I think, is important to get mentors from other institutions, whether that be peer or faculty or anyone that can kind of help you, guide you through the process. Because when you do have a failure, and we all have had failures, right? When you have good mentors or you have this good peer support, you are more likely to kind of persist through that difficult situation, right? I told this story, I think, when I did another workshop a couple weeks ago, and I was telling the story about how when I wrote my first grant proposal, it was just a university level grant. I sent in the proposal to my supervisor, and he sent it back, and it was just like all red. Like, I think there was like maybe 5 sentences that were like, he was like, this is good. And everything else on the 3 pages was like, we should fix this, right? But he was a good mentor in that he didn't tell me that I was dumb, right? He told me that I could do it. It just needed, it was my first time ever writing a grant. And so he kind of helped and supported me through that situation rather than like drug me down and said like, oh, well, you didn't do well on this one, so maybe you aren't cut out for graduate school. So finding that kind of peer and faculty support to say like, you can do it. And like, even though you aren't going to write the perfect grant, you aren't going to write the first perfect paper as graduate students, but finding the support system that says, not yet, but you can, and you will be able to do this later. And an important part I think about verbal persuasion that we don't talk about a lot is the idea of good, honest feedback. Because how many of you have done peer review in like a class, whether that be an undergrad or in one of your grad classes, right? And a lot of times when we're doing peer review, I mean, I'm guilty of this too. You don't want to be like the person that's mean. So you don't necessarily give full feedback, right? And so there's a way to be constructive and not harsh. And so I think that is an important part of verbal persuasion too, that we don't talk about. And we say, you can do it, and like, this is how you can do it. So that's where kind of the verbal support comes in from your peers or your faculty or other mentors that you have. And then lastly, these ideas of physiological responses. A big one is kind of stress management. I know that's really difficult to say. Like, that's like, I have generalized anxiety disorder. And so like telling me to manage my stress is like telling me to calm down when I'm overwhelmed. And like, so it's an easy thing to say, but it's like harder to put into practice. And stress management can look different for every person. And so I like to meditate. Like I have never had a sip of coffee in my entire life. And I've made it through 15 years as a student without any coffee. And so I need like a 10-minute meditation in the morning to kind of like manage my day, and then I'm ready to go. Right. And so kind of figuring out what kind of stress management works for you, whether that be meditation, whether that be working out. I regret to inform you that I went for a walk this morning at 6:30, and it actually did make my day much better. So they aren't lying to you when they say getting up and working out and moving your body is good, because I would really much have rather slept until 9, but it did work. But any kind of stress management, breathing exercises, going out and getting a massage, whatever kind of works for you to manage your stress will help kind of lower those negative or maladaptive physiological responses when you get into a situation in which you're not confident. And then, in going back to the self-reflection part, monitoring your emotions is huge in terms of building your confidence, right? Because if you want to know when you had those physiological responses. So saying like, oh, I had a test on Tuesday and my palms got really sweaty, and making note of that and saying like, next time I have a test, if I prepared the same way, did I have less physiological responses? Maybe why did I have less or more physiological responses? What about the environment was different? What about the content was different? Things like that, and kind of monitoring when you have these emotional responses are really important for you to understand what kind of situations put you in a mental state that you have these maybe maladaptive physiological responses. And so that's all that I have for you content-wise. Does anyone have any questions?
Hello,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, I guess. Hi everyone, this is Benji. Thanks for the presentation. My question is, do you have any advice related to work and life balance?
Well, work and life balance. I'm a big work and life balance person. Like I tell all of my students in my classes, and maybe this makes me a weird professor. My class is like the least important class that you will ever take. I teach research methods, right? Like we're not like solving world hunger or like making changes in the world, right? And so I'm a big believer in like making sure that you set time aside for yourself, because it's going to lead to those negative, like your confidence will get lower if you are pushing yourself to the brink, right? And so like if you are not balancing work and life, right, and that will probably lead to not so great work, right, and not so great experiences in your life, right? And so then you're going to have that maybe failure on a paper or failure on a test, and it might cause you to spiral, right? But having kind of building up those kind of stress management techniques, I need a planner for everything. Like I write everything down and kind of organize my system, just because I know that that's going to help me manage my work and life. But I think it's also important to like have a shut off time, right? Like I took all of the email off of my phone because I was checking it constantly, right? It was like 8:30 p.m. and I was checking my email, 11 p.m. checking my email, as soon as I got up checking my email. And so kind of setting those boundaries is really important, because it not only I think it builds your efficacy in like your success to manage your work and life if you set boundaries.
Okay, awesome, thanks.
The presentation slides, Josh from Grad Academy. I don't know if he's here anymore. I don't see him anymore. But if they aren't, you can always email me and I can send them to you. I'll put my email in the chat, and you can email me if you'd like the presentation slides. How many of you have struggled? Oh, what are the someone asked in the chat, what are the best ways to overcome anxiety when it comes to presentation? For me personally, I've found that good preparation is like the first step to overcoming that anxiety. So like I said before, I am a procrastinator. And so when I was doing presentations, I taught I taught 2 undergrad classes during my doc program. And so I would constantly be like reevaluating like the lecture, practicing things like that, because that kind of helped me to lower the stress. Because I do, like, even now, like I talk about physiological responses, like I'm sweating because I'm nervous, right? And so it doesn't necessarily go away, but there's a good balance in anxiety, right? It's not always anxiety. It could just be excitement, right? Somebody talked about this before, of like that balance between when anxiety gets like too far, but a little bit of excitement is good. And so I think preparation is a big part of anxiety, not preventing anxiety, but dealing with anxiety. Sometimes I like to have somebody come and watch me when I do presentations. Some people don't like to do that. I like to do it because I think it gives I can get that almost immediate feedback and verbal support, right? Because you're going to be your harshest critic, right? You're going to say that presentation was awful, I messed this up, and you're going to focus on the smallest parts of things that maybe you misspoke. But if you have a colleague that you trust come and watch you and say they can give you a more objective evaluation of your performance and your presentation, and so that can be that almost immediate like verbal persuasion support to kind of balance out any anxiety that you're feeling when it comes to the presentation. And then another thing that I like to do is like breathing. I am from New Jersey, and so I tried to practice this presentation so that it would, but I talk really fast when I get nervous because it's just, I'm from New Jersey, this is how we talk. And so kind of just breathing and taking pauses, especially when you're doing presentations, is really important. No one, this is a big thing, no one expects you to know everything. So it is okay when you're doing a presentation and somebody asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, it is okay to say, oh, I've never thought of it that way, or I don't know the literature on that, or I haven't seen that in the literature, right? And say, I will look into it and I can always get back to you, right? There's no harm in admitting that you don't know something. It doesn't make you less able in your position or less worthy of being here. And so having that, I think, in your pocket of saying like, oh, I can just say, I'm going to look into that more, might help in dealing with anxiety. You don't have to be omniscient and know everything about the subject. Oh, Josh, there was a question of whether the presentation slides will be available after this.
Sure. Yes.
Okay, I gave everyone my email address in the chat, and so if you want, you can just email me and I have them to send as well.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I don't know why it seemed like the internet went down for a moment here, so I disappeared. But yes, absolutely. So, yeah, if you want to share them with them, you're more than welcome to, or we can also. Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions?
And feel free to unmute your mics or just drop questions in the chat if you'd like. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hoff. If there's no other questions, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Hoff. Before we end today's session, we'd like to thank our presenter for sharing her time and expertise with us today, and to thank all of our participants for joining us today. Before you all log off, please take a few moments to fill out this workshop survey that I am about to drop in the chat now. It really helps us out with any future programs that we facilitate. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much again to Dr. Hoffman. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful.